people with whom I've had many good conversations, as well as some people not so well known to me. Those of you who are new to this wonderful space, please take part in more of our conversations. I'm not going to speak at length now. We're delighted that Bruce Robbins has come to talk with us. I've had the opportunity to introduce Bruce here quite a number of times, dating back to my early years here in the early 1990s. Today, Paul Beauvais, distinguished professor in the English department and editor of Boundary 2, which Bruce and I both collaborate with him and others on. Paul will do the honors because Bruce is here under Paul's auspices. Paul.
Thanks, Jonathan. And thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to welcome Bruce Robbins back to the University of Pittsburgh, where I too have had the chance to introduce him before, often around a Boundary 2 event. We're fortunate that Bruce was able to come in today to serve as the external examiner on a very distinguished dissertation in these areas. And he was, as always, contributing and helpful. We don't need to talk too much about Bruce Robbins because you all know him and his work, even more because he's been here so often. But I do think that in light of an email which Bruce has sent me just very recently, containing the link to a manifesto issued by some people who want to revisit the formation of Victorian studies in the United States, that I would want to take a moment to emphasize one element of Bruce's own work that is brought back to mind when I read this proposal that he sent me for materials that might appear in the journal we all edit. But before I do that, let me just give you a very brief reminder of who Bruce Robbins is, for anyone who happens to require that reminder. He's, of course, professor at Columbia University. He's a Harvard PhD, as you all know. He's the author of almost innumerable books. It's come to be a cliche in the Boundary 2 processes of introduction to say everyone who comes is the author of more than a dozen books and more than 100 review articles. So in Bruce's case, we always double the numbers, just to make sure that you know. The range of his work is, of course, truly astonishing. His writing about upward mobility, his writing on the common good, his ability to think seriously about problems that are common in public discourse, thanks to the work of people like Habermas, to bring literature into the public sphere, to make the questions of the welfare state resonate around questions of class, to bring the entire history of the novel as a form of representation into dialogue with such large contemporary questions. All of these things would be enough for anyone and in their career, but for Bruce, they're only a small bit of what he does. Bruce is clearly recognized in the profession as one of the main and most important public citizens of the profession. And I think we will all honor him for that, as well as for his scholarly work as his career goes on. In recent years, he's been revisiting his groundbreaking and formative work on cosmopolitanism with one book which I think appeared in 2012 from Duke University Press called Cosmopolitanism, Perpetual War, Cosmopolitanism from the Viewpoint of Violence. And he is working on another companion volume on cosmopolitanism entitled Beneficiary, Cosmopolitanism from the Viewpoint of Inequality. He's also produced an important documentary called Some of My Best Friends Are Zionists. Those of you who've been here at times have had the chance to see him screen parts of it, either in this room or in the English department, right beneath this space. That is a film that centers on American Jews, including intellectuals such as Tony Kushner and Judith Butler. Jews who have alternative points of view on Israel and on the Arab Middle East. But to go back to the Victorian link that he sent me, in the midst of the Victorian link, the manifesto of these neo-Victorians, there's a concern among them that new modes of contemporary academic practice had begun to treat literature too much from a distance and too much on the surface, and had abandoned, in a way, to a kind of positivist historiography, and to like romance with the archive conceived within the terms of a positivist historiography, had abandoned the act of criticism. I wanted to point out to you that whatever else Bruce Robbins' career stands for intellectually and politically, it stands for the opposite, I think, of such instantiation and surface study. I'm going to just refer to an article that is in the book, Perpetual War, Cosmopolitanism for Violence, because I want to refer to an article that was first published in Boundary 2 on Anthony Appiah, because I want to use it as a way of indicating how committed, in contrast to the putative norm of positivist archivalism, Bruce Robbins remains to consistent, close reading and rigorous critique. The essay is called Cosmopolitanism, Newer and New, and it takes a hard look not only at Appiah's reiteration that one can be both a nationalist, a patriot, and at the same time a true cosmopolitanism, but Bruce also takes a close look at the consequences, many of which are undesirable, he convinces me, of the reiteration of cosmopolitanist discourse when it's done with too much confidence in the virtue of that figure. I'll offer you an alternative in Bruce's language. He poses this question in the midst of reporting on his own weight on cosmopolitanism. He says, quote, celebrations of cosmopolitan diversity have largely been uninterrupted by the issues of economic equality or geopolitical justice. I wonder whether it isn't time to stop and ask how much of the praise is merited, what work cosmopolitanism is and isn't doing. So at the end of that quotation. So with that reminder of how Bruce Robbins always brings us back to the probative questions of valorization, valuation, and criticism. I'll give you Bruce Robbins, who today will speak on the topic, the absence of imagination. Please welcome Bruce.
Thank you, Paul, for an introduction way beyond my desserts. Thank you all for being here. It's always a pleasure to be here, I mean, honestly, and it's a special pleasure now, right? I probably owe you a bit of an apology for offering something that's a bit half-baked. This started out as an essay about the use of Nietzsche's idea of eternal return or eternal recurrence in Kundera's The Unbearable Lightness of Being and in David Mitchell's Clouds Atlas. And that's kind of interesting, but as the essay developed, first David Mitchell fell out, and finally Kundera fell out. So this is kind of what was left of the thinking when all of that was gone, which is, you'll see, I've just been writing it now, but there are some references, at least to the Kundera, that will make no sense unless I said what I just said. On March 9th, 2015, not very long ago, Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras made a speech in Parliament renewing a call for Germany to repay reparations to Greece for the crimes and unpaid debts of the Nazis. According to the New York Times, I quote, Berlin responded firmly, insisting that the reparations issue is long settled, and the German news media reacted angrily. If one takes Athens seriously, then Greece itself, which is so proud of Alexander the Great, would have to fear demands for historical injustice, Reinhard Müller wrote in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. So, if we can judge from this quotation, the assumption in Germany seems to be that the relation between Germany in 2015 and the crimes of the Nazis from 1939 to 1945, or before, is ethnically identical to the relation between Greece in 2015 and the crimes of Alexander the Great, roughly 336 to 323 BCE. We could have laughed at that. Or more precisely, that because it would be absurd for anyone to come forward today claiming reparations for Alexander's military campaigns 2,350 years ago, it is equally absurd for the Greeks to come forward now and claim reparations for the villages wiped out, the hundreds of thousands of famine victims, the emptying of the national treasury, and so on, committed by the Nazis maybe 70 years ago. It's assumed that events that occurred 70 years ago and events that occurred 2,350 years ago have the same ethical status. Ethically speaking, both are what the man in the street might call ancient history. To call something ancient history means to say that there's no ethical relation between then and now. In effect, debts have been canceled by the passage of time. For ancient history, our motto is, let bygones be bygones. You may disagree with the Germans, as I personally do. You may even be astonished to see the Germans assume that debts Greece incurred after 2001 belong to a radically different category than debts Germany incurred after, say, 1941. Debts incurred in 2001 must be repaid. Debts incurred in 1941 no longer exist. The powerful can turn history into ancient history, and at an ever-accelerating rate. Still, I think you would have to agree that the idea of claiming victimhood for the atrocities committed by Alexander the Great really would be absurd, as are the claims of settlers on the West Bank that the Palestinian land they have stolen was conquered and is rightfully theirs based on the political status of Judea and Samaria 3,000 years ago. In other words, this is what I'm trying to work through, some things really are ancient history in an ethically significant sense. Put it more crudely, the passage of time does matter ethically and politically. This is a process I think the humanities have trouble acknowledging, but that we need to acknowledge and try to understand better than we do, if only to make discriminations within it. And the larger project that this is part of is about that. The humanities have tended lately to dismiss linear, irreversible time as philosophically naive and offensively Eurocentric. One side of a binary that supposedly divides the world between modern and pre-modern, developed and underdeveloped, us and them. It is maybe as a European that Kundera sees linear, irreversible time, this is the part that I've cut out, as an argument for Nietzschean likeness, for the virtues attendant upon losing, forgetting, forgiving, letting go of grievances. As a then citizen of what used to be called the Second World, Kundera did not seem eager to embrace a post-colonial identity within Europe, whether as a Czech victim of the Soviets or, looking further back, as representative of a people incorporated into and subordinated by previous empires. His assumption may be a characteristically European, or at least an un-American one. If you go far enough back in time, everyone has suffered unspeakable wrongs, and everyone has probably also committed unspeakable wrongs. In the interest of present peace, therefore, it's better to forget those wrongs than to remember them. In certain times and places, this is a cynical permissiveness. That's a term that Kundera uses to describe Nietzsche on The Eternal Return. Cynical permissiveness might be an eligible option. Might be. I can't say where I would stand myself in a confrontation between lightness or cynical permissiveness on the one hand, and on the other, the academic heaviness that is committed to taking that which is ephemeral, hence dead in advance, and restoring life to it, preserving its eternal meaning before it can fade, and therefore also keeping the sharp edge of moral evaluation as well honed as possible. Seen from another angle, this restoration is the work of imagination, imposing narrative meaning on ephemera that have already lost it or maybe never had it. Along with eternal recurrence, Kundera also shares with Nietzsche the premise that history is a chaotic succession of meaningless particulars that are organized to the extent that they can be organized only by myths, fictions, acts of imagination. In this, I think he's representative, for better or worse, of contemporary common sense. It's this common sense that I'm kind of aiming at and hope I will be able to get back to at the end of this without driving you crazy with boredom. I'm cutting out a passage here which leads up triumphantly to Frederick Jameson's unfashionable notion that human history might make sense as a single great collective story being back on the agenda these days for reasons of global warming, if not for other reasons. The notion that history is utterly meaningless obviously could not be the slogan of a discipline like ours that is so visibly proud of its historical rigor and indeed identifies itself, at least when pressed, as the one place readers can go to find the historical context that will reliably tell them what texts really mean. For us, it would seem history can't be meaningless. And yet Kundera's invocation of Nietzsche and eternal return seems anything but offensive to today's common sense. We routinely talk as if only an idiot could have faith in future progress, something that Nietzsche and Kundera are both aiming at. Any look ahead toward progress, whether or not one has faith in it, suggests to Nietzsche and to us that we are imagining time as the dimension in which we can and must seek redemption. We hold this to be a mistake. It's against this background that we embrace what I would call, and I hope you'll recognize it, constructionism, the not unfamiliar idea that historical narratives in this like beauty or truth or emancipation are constructs. X is a construct. In doing so, we attribute a heroic role to Nietzschean myth-making or to the imagination, which is to say, to our own agency. To quote the political theorist Bonnie Honig, one can measure the strength of one's will by one's ability to do without meaning in things. That is, by the extent to which, I'm quoting her again, one can endure to live in a meaningless world because one organizes a small portion of it oneself. I could stop and ask you whether this sounds like common sense. I hope you will be asking yourselves. One reason why I enjoy quoting Bonnie Honig is that she has always been a bit skeptical about historical skepticism. And this, although it's, you might say, where she comes from. Already discontented in the 1990s with constructionist common sense, she pointed out then that in his doctrine of eternal return, Nietzsche was echoing Kant's first formulation of the categorical imperative. Kant says in that first formulation, the question in each and every thing, do you desire this once more and innumerable times more, would be upon your actions as the greatest weight. These are very nearly Nietzsche's words. There is a difference, of course, as Honig says. Eternal recurrence tests the self's relations to the actions it is about to perform, not to those already past. But Nietzsche, too, is putting actions to an ethical test. Like Kant, he is asking the self to stop and consider the meaning of its action in relation to a totality of actions. The therapy of the will that Honig underlines in Nietzsche is inconsistent, I think, with time considered as meaningless flux. One might even say that her Nietzsche, rather than being the relentless critic of linear temporality and progress he's most often taken to be, would be opening time up to improvement. For what's the point of willing better if not to produce some sort of improvement, even if the norm by which that improvement might be measured remains unspecified? To me, at least, it makes no sense to cultivate the will if we demand that the will be blind to its past acts, incurious as to which acts have failed, which have succeeded, and why. And if you can say improvement, you can also say progress, not the guaranteed progress that the doctrine of eternal recurrence was anxious to replace, but progress without guarantees. In the humanities, a conversation about history as progress seems to me a non-starter. And I think this is less because we know we're living in the Anthropocene than because before we signed on to that painful self-periodization, our default position was already melancholic. It's as if at its founding the discipline had collectively pledged to preserve in perpetuity an archive of irreducible trauma. This is why we've been so receptive to new forms of melancholy. In a recent essay of Honig's on Jonathan Lear and Lars von Trier, a powerful critique of various fashionable sorts of melancholy. Honig describes the new melancholics, who've been especially influential in queer theory and in eco-criticism, as celebrating a fate without future. There are, of course, good historical reasons for melancholy these days as a theory of history, for example, the job crisis. And that's one I come back to very, very frequently. But there are also historical reasons for resilience, the counter-theory Honig puts up against it. I'm going to skip again a little bit. A sympathetic viewer of Lars von Trier's film Melancholia, which I, for one, am not, would probably want to connect its apocalyptic imagination of colliding planets with the historical context of global warming, which makes the colliding planets premise seem less outlandish. Equally relevant is the HIV/AIDS epidemic, which is an obvious context for the conjoining of melancholy and queer theory, as in the Edelman's influential book No Future. For Edelman, the future is inescapably imagined in heteronormative terms. I quote, "Politics, however radical the means by which specific constituencies attempt to produce a more desirable social order, remains at its core conservative. Insofar as it works to affirm a structure to authenticate social order, which it then intends to transmit to the future in the form of its inner child. That child remains the perpetual horizon of every acknowledged politics, the phantasmatic beneficiary of every political intervention. If what we act for is the children, then better not to act at all. This entails a refusal of, I'm quoting again, history as linear narrative, poor man's duality, in which meaning succeeds in revealing itself as itself through time, far from partaking of this narrative movement toward a viable political future, far from perpetuating the fantasy of meaning's eventual realization. The queer comes to figure the bar to every realization of futurity, the resistance to every social structure or form." That's the end of the quote. I'm not sure non-heteronormative experience is the self-evident or satisfying support for melancholic temporality that it is often taken to be. Especially given that, from a global perspective, the LGBTQ community in the United States seems self-evidently to have made what I would call progress over the decades since, say, the 1950s, since the medical establishment belatedly addressed the project of getting HIV/AIDS under control, since the repeal of DOMA, and so on. If we can tell depressed gay high school kids that it gets better, it seems strange not to be able to say it gets better to anyone else. But maybe we can. In her book, The Deaths of the Author, Jane Gallup notices that when Gayatri Spivak talks about her work as the author of a critique of post-colonial reason, she uses the word progress. As in the sentence, my book charts a practitioner's progress. Progress, Gallup goes on, does not seem like a word one would expect Spivak to use. The word progress generally denotes the most triumphant relation to temporality. Progress here represents the least troubled or troubling, the most positive version of a writer's change over time. That's the end of the quote. In fact, Gallup concludes, this somewhat conventional phrasing is quite atypical of the book. Having noticed this mild inconsistency, a critique of progress in general, yet an embrace of progress at the local level of one's own work, I have gone looking for other instances of it. This is perverse, but scholars have too much time on their hands, you know. A related inconsistency pops up, it seems to me, in Max Weber's famous lecture, Scholarship as a Vocation, Wissenschaft als Beruf. It's the strong argument of that lecture, many of you will remember it, that we have fallen into what Weber calls polytheism, a somewhat melancholic condition, in which progress is impossible because each collectivity follows its own gods. And there is no commonly shared membership, no overarching religious or political principle that would adjudicate among them or mark out any course of action as an advance over any other. And yet, Weber also says in that essay that scholars to be must resign themselves to seeing their work rendered obsolescent by those researchers who come afterwards. Unlike art, where there is no progress, Weber says, scholarship, or Wissenschaft, is chained to the course of progress. In science, as a result, this is a quote, each of us knows that what he's accomplished will be antiquated in 10, 20, 50 years. This is the fate to which science is subjected. Wissenschaft. It's the very meaning of scientific work. Every scientific fulfillment raises new questions. It asks to be surpassed and outdated. Whoever wishes to serve science has to resign himself to this fact. So if our work will be surpassed and outdated, that's not just something to which we have to resign ourselves. It's not just a grim fate to which we are chained. It is a fact that ought to give us a certain satisfaction. It means we belong to a collectivity which recognizes the value of our work, takes advantage of our work, builds on our work. In other words, a collectivity that experiences progress. But progress at the level of research, progress within the community of scholars. This is also the sort of quiet, almost unacknowledged progress that sneaks into the revisionist account of human rights offered by Peter Dybala in his new book, The Architecture of Concepts. In the history of human rights, the thing to do these days, some of you will know this, is to kick the foundations out from under the older, Whiggish, self-congratulatory histories by insisting on an extreme discontinuity. Samuel Moyn's book, The Last Utopia, is representative, it's very high representative. Instead of locating the significant point of origin for human rights in the revolutions of the 18th century, with the most significant later development happening in the wake of World War II, as in Lynn Hunt's Inventing Human Rights, Moyn argues that human rights really only emerge in the 1970s, and they emerge, quote, seemingly from nowhere. Dybala's version also puts the emphasis on discontinuity, though in a different way. Dybala's argument, like Moyn's, assumes a radical discontinuity between the 18th century and the present. For Dybala, there was an extraordinary 18th century moment associated with Tom Paine, when the rights of man were imagined outside the model of property rights, which he doesn't like. Right. But that moment was lost, and the dominant tradition of human rights has seen them as specifiable, actionable possessions. In many ways, not a good thing. So there has been no progress in the domain of human rights. And yet, as soon as Dybala begins to speak about scholarship about human rights, especially scholarship in the digital humanities, which he's doing, progress suddenly reappears. If one finds the dominant narrative of human rights compelling, Dybala argues, one will see, quote, the movement from natural rights to the rights of man as simply a further refinement or extension of the long tradition of rights discourse. But as recent studies have begun to show, I pause at recent studies have begun to show, in order to make the meta point not about history itself, but about the unacknowledged incongruity between, on the one hand, a rejection of any single progressive tradition in the history of human rights, and on the other hand, what looks very much like an embrace, even an uncritical embrace, of a progressive tradition in the history of scholarship. It's as if the recentness of the scholarship could be taken as a guarantee that it is reliable, authoritative, even uncontroversial. In other words, there's a strange metacritical return here to history as progress, on condition, as with Weber, that the progress be restricted inside the world of scholarship. One might say that Weber is, after all, comfortable enough with linear history, but only to the extent that the linear history in question represents regress rather than progress, as long as it represents a disenchantment of the world, an entrapment in an iron cage, or some other sort of melancholic decline. Again, there's something similar in Dybala. For Dybala, unlike for Moyne, the 18th century antecedents of human rights discourse are real and remain real. That is, they are determining of human rights discourse in the present, but they're determining in an undesirable way. The bad sense of rights, as specifiable entitlements on the model of property rights, has continued from the 18th century, Dybala argues, and has helped render the present concept of human rights incoherent and unhelpful. But there did exist a good, or at least a better sense of human rights in the 18th century. The conceptual innovation Dybala attributes to Tom Paine is by contrast vague, unspecifiable, and also non-actionable. And Dybala shows by digital word searches that Paine's sense of rights did not catch on, in spite of the popularity of his title, nearly as much as the popularity of the phrase would suggest. I should not improvise because I had just written that out. On the contrary, it was lost sight of, and thus was not historically determined. Thus today it remains as a kind of ideal, as aspirational, a resource offered up by the past to the present, one which might guide human rights discourse today out of the mess it's in. Its untimeliness, of course, fits within a very traditional structure of argument for the humanities, going back through T.S. Eliot to Matthew Arnold. It offers a heroic rationale to people like ourselves, who, rich in our knowledge of the untimely, reach back for those neglected antecedents and bring them forward to rescue an otherwise misguided present. I hope what I just said was clear enough for you to consider the temporal structure of this argument. On the one hand, history is indeed a determining agent, continuous with the present, its effects still visible in the present, but it's continuous with the present only in a constraining and undesirable way. On the other hand, history offers to the present nobler alternatives that it can draw on, but only on the condition that the present can reach across the abyss of time to seize those alternatives, alternatives that are not allowed to be already available within the present. What seems to be absolutely taboo here is the other combination of the same terms, namely, history as continuous with the present, but continuous with the present in a good or desirable way. To my mind, it makes no sense to accept the one combination and not the other. I'm going to repeat myself. It's not historical continuity as such that's ruled out. It's only history that comes bearing good news. Why should there be a taboo on good news? There's no respect here for historical discontinuity. Causal continuity is a no-no if it seems Whiggish or triumphalist, but it passes without comment if it leads toward catastrophe. This is completely incoherent. If the past can be continuous with the present in a bad way, as the slippery slope on the way to disaster, on what grounds can we possibly exclude the idea that it might also be continuous with the present in a good way? Really, I should stop because that's what I came to say. But I'm not going to. So one more example of this strangely inconsistent anti-Whiggism. In his recent book, Returns, Becoming Indigenous in the 21st Century, James Clifford writes, "Not so long ago, the diverse people we now call indigenous were almost universally thought to have no futures. They were people without history, destined to disappear. Progressive history was destiny. This was just the way things were. But a contradictory reality, the fact that small-scale tribal peoples do have futures, has been a surprise of the late 20th century a source of anthropological enlightenment, in Marshall Salen's phrase, 2000, chapter 15. Unexpected outcomes like this show that history isn't hurting us all the same way. So you can see where I'm trying to hurt you with this. Clifford joins the chorus of those denouncing progressive history, but his passage itself tells a linear developmental narrative. One might even describe this tale of anthropological enlightenment as a grand narrative. It begins with not so long ago, then it reveals a surprise, a pleasant surprise. The surprise is that things have changed for indigenous people and changed for the better, especially, though not exclusively, in what is thought about indigenous people by non-indigenous scholars. In scholarship about indigenous peoples and in the lives of indigenous peoples themselves, there has been what we can only call progress, progress that can be seen as both a result and a cause of the new scholarship. So Clifford's story, too, is an example of the progressive history that he sometimes assumes we've given up on. To make of these inconsistencies. In the world, a firm, almost unthinking rejection of anything that looks like Whiggish complacency. In scholarship, an acknowledgement that progress is absolutely real and happens all the time. One possible moral is, if we're skeptical about progress in the real world, we might be more skeptical that the new is the better in scholarship. And, more of my point, if we acknowledge progress in our scholarship, we might be more willing to acknowledge progress in the real world, as I have to say Clifford does to his credit. So this is the argument I'm trying really to get on the table. It seems to me, here I get very speculative, that this inconsistency, anti-progress on one scale, pro-progress on another, might, after all, be resolvable. Maybe the reason scholars can acknowledge progress within scholarship is that they feel themselves to belong as scholars to a collectivity, shared values. Whereas collectivity is not something that humanists ordinarily experience as citizens. That is, there exists no larger collectivity that expresses for us humanistic values. If this is right, then the task for humanists who want real-world progress would be finding or fomenting real-world, larger-scale equivalents for the scholarly experience of collectivity. So this is it is a conclusion. I hope I haven't been going on too long, but I have to explain my title, so it will take me another couple of pages. Since the publication of Meta-History 40 years ago, the rejection of progressive history has been associated, rightly or wrongly, with Hayden White. Citing Hayden White, Lisa Lowe, for example, argues that differences of nation, language, religion, gender, race, and class make it absurd to imagine an individual moving in a linear fashion through a single, stable social totality. For Lowe, and in her view, for White, history is made up of infinite differences. We know the differences are infinite because, as Judith Butler has noted, we can never get rid of an embarrassed etc. hanging on to the end of every list of identities. It's because differences are infinite, so the logic goes, that society cannot be a totality and its story cannot be told in a grand narrative. Now it seems to me that at different points in his career, Hayden White actually takes different positions toward grand narrative. In Meta-History, he seems to call for a grand narrative, understood as Nietzschean myth, that is, as an arbitrary but somehow life-enhancing way of organizing a world of otherwise meaningless things. And later he seems to suggest that it would be better to present the meaningless things as they are, that is, to do without narrative altogether. So this is the value of narrativity in the representation of reality, where he says all narrative moralizes. It moralizes by its closure. It moralizes because it's organized around a single center or subject. It would be better not to moralize. It would be better to forsake the deceptions of narrative in favor of, say, medieval annals, which have neither subject nor closure, but simply list events in chronological order, each one an incomprehensible singularity, unconnected in any way to the events around it. For example, here's where I should have a screen, but I didn't ask for one. 709, hard winter. 710, hard year and deficient in crops. 7:11. 7:12, flood everywhere. 7:13. 7:14, Pippin, mayor of the palace, died. 7:15. 7:16. 7:17. 7:18, Charles fought against the Saxon with great destruction. 7:19. And so on. White ends rather neatly with 7:32, Charles fought against the Saracens at Poitiers on a Saturday. You were supposed to laugh at us on a Saturday. We're not told the outcome of the battle, we're told that it happened on a Saturday. The list is full of gaps, but empty of explanation. It has no subject to gather its multitude of particulars together. It has no order other than the chronological. One might say, therefore, that the annals form accepts the true chaos of things. A list of incommensurables like this should not sound utterly unfamiliar. I, for one, have tried to wake students out of their dogmatic slumbers by reading them Borges's Chinese Encyclopedia as quoted by Foucault. I'm not going to read it now. So I address this question to myself as well as to you. Are we sure that the world, in fact, comes to us as a chaos of meaningless particulars, unordered except by the arbitrary acts of imagination that we impose on it? So here I finally get to my title. Wallace Stevens, in his poem, The Plain Sense of Things, has the line, yet the absence of imagination had itself to be imagined. There are no doubt other ways of reading this line, but to me, here and now, it means this: the initial chaos that we posit as a sort of raw material, sitting and waiting for imagination to work on it, this supposed chaos of particulars is not the plain sense of things, not a bedrock reality we can take for granted. It too can be interrogated. It is as much a construct as any other construct, and perhaps it's time for it to get the same scrutiny as other constructs. After all, we know that the formula X is a construct is ultimately incoherent. If everything is a construct, if everything is imagined, what about imagination? Is imagination also a construct? Wouldn't we have to imagine its absence, so to speak, so that it too could then be constructed? What constructs the constructor? Infinite regress seems inevitable. In an essay on Hayden White, the Australian critic Ian Hunter argues that the presupposition underlying White's sense of narrative comes from Kant, and more specifically from a Kantian imperative to doubt and scrutinize the self. If knowledge has its conditions, then, Hunter cites Wittgenstein, doubt also has its conditions. It's a good line. I quote, rather than the chaotic or indeterminate character of experience leading to doubt, it is the exercise of a certain practice of doubt that leads experience to be treated as chaotic or indeterminate. For Hunter, the idea that experience is meaningless flux is a founding assumption of our post-Kantian, self-scrutinizing scholarly community, though, as we have seen, it is not the assumption that the community extends to the scholarly work it itself performs. As I hope will be clear by now, I've been trying by various means to instill some doubt as to this practice of doubt, and as to the notion of scholarly work it generates, the imagination heroically organizing a reality that possesses no ordering principles of its own, a reality whose deep truth is the chaos of meaningless particulars. I have no vision of ordered progression to replace it with. The case for actual progress in the era of the Anthropocene is a lot more than I'm ready to take on. But for now, it seems enough to question the scholarly common sense that throws up insuperable obstacles to even starting that conversation. Yes, there's a job crisis. Yes, there's global warming. But these facts have been serving as excuses for persisting in a melancholic posture toward history that has other origins and is sustained by other logics. It suits us to believe that history needs us to organize it because it has no organizing principles of its own. But we would understand the job crisis and the global warming crisis better if we did not see them as unconnected catastrophes, like the debris that piles up in front of Benjamin's Angel of History. Maybe it's time for Benjamin's angel to be retired as the figure of what otherwise secular academics seem to hold most sacred. If we could see those catastrophes as part of an overarching historical narrative that is not just imagined, we could also find ourselves capable of seeing in history something other than catastrophe and ruin. Thank you.
Lots of time for questions.
Totally in support of this, not just impatience, but it has to be a total refusal of melancholy, which is dominated for too long across our scholarly spectrums and our politics. So I'm totally in support of that. It saturates the art world and art world thinking about modernism and contemporary art, as it does other worlds. Which is part of why many of us try and think about contemporaneity and the contemporaneity of different kinds of difference, which actually come from histories in different ways, with different powers, and at different speeds, and to try and picture history, capital H, in that kind of way. So, a couple of points, just for your comment. One would be whether you think it would be helpful to think about so how the past has purchased on the present as having taken a form in recent years that I think will not so much fall in the common sense of the scholarly community, but a more public common sense. And certainly what I've noticed as a common sense or a shared field of belief of a generation of people brought up on the net and so on and so forth, which in relation to history, it often seems to be sort of reductively kind of history channel version. And if we think about it spatially, if we think about how a person living now relates to an imagined history in the past or projected history that could happen, or many different histories that happened in the past, because it's no longer one big history, it's lots of small ones of different powers and so on. If we think about that spatially, the thing that struck me in recent years is that what's pervasive and and I'd like to comment on this, is a sense that if you go beyond the almost immediate present, there seems to be a kind of moat. And beyond that, almost every other history that ever occurred or could be imagined as occurring is occurring there, in the same place. And so the critique that we're not talking about linear history, that falls away because linear history is not actually what many people nowadays actually have in their minds. They have lots of possible histories in the present. And this applies obviously to someone in ISIS in a very different sort of way, how but just that thought, the spatialization of it, not in terms of linearity, but in terms of, we're here and we're surrounded and it's in an array, but at roughly equal distance, and any of it could become present and could become future. Does that make sense?
I recognize it, but I can't tell whether you're saying it's our common sense and it's a good thing, or it's our common sense and it's a bad thing.
No.
Pardon my crudeness, but
I don't think that's a scholarly common sense, because I don't think that's an idea that is widely even not recognized. I think it is a so-called common sense for a lot of people of a certain generation, like students sitting here tonight.
they can say.
Who can say. But more an assumption about that. And a bad thing, in most ways, yes, I would say in most ways, yes. But in other ways, I think it goes to the point of construction, I'm not sure it's an either or about construction or not construction. It's obvious that constructions become often fictions and they become real and they actually move history. So there's, you know, there's that. So to actually assess that, what we're kind of seeing sort of given up is a way of assessing that, except this, as you say, melancholic story.
Yeah, I mean, for us to assess it, there would have to be some standard to assess it by.
Exactly.
And I think we've largely given up.
Given that up, which they absolutely must not.
So just to say, I mean, obviously I think that we need a better metaphor for the kind of work that we do as meaningful work. I think maybe better work than imagination, in the sense that you can work on something that's as real as you are. Whereas imagination makes it seem like there's this passive object over there, and you are the magician working your magic on it. But it's not pushing back in any way, you know, and you're not continuous with it. And I think that's a mistake, but one to which, I don't know, I could be wrong about the common sense. Maybe I'm prone to it, and no one else is prone to it.
A question, I guess. What collectively has the intellectual community, why have they been able to see progress in scholarship historically, but resisted movements, progressive movements in the real world? Or seeing that there are even worse such things, and separated their scholarship from that to the extent that you're arguing has been happening.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is a much more complicated and even contradictory thing, because on some level we do try to connect ourselves to progressive movements.
Right.
I guess maybe what this is about on some level is a tension that I've always felt between fellow feeling with fellow academics about the need and desire to connect ourselves to progressive things, and at the same time wanting to feel that we are heroically rescuing a past which everyone else has forgotten, and therefore committed in that sense to a melancholy view of the present, which is only going to forget all the things that we care about and which therefore needs us. So it makes us feel really important, whereas being part of progressive movement, well, yeah, there's this movement which is at least as important as we are, and in fact might be a lot more important than we are, to which we might not even be able to make a great contribution, frankly. So that's something which is, it feels like it's been inside forever.
But it sounds like there's something very counter-progressive to the attempt to be progressive in one's scholarship.
Can be. It certainly can be. Does this make any sense to anybody? I mean, I have this very eccentric feeling giving this talk. You know?
I'm just going to speculate with you a little bit and associate. You said earlier this afternoon, in Rachel's defense, that you were a new critic.
Oh, ouch.
You did.
Totally unfair. It's like Paul quoting from this Victorian link.
No, I know, but you know.
You've been trained it.
Yeah, trained as a new critic. I mean, I pull it out because the first associations with this terminology that come up for me are Murray Krieger's account of and defense of the new criticism, where the idea that poetry is entirely a defense against a completely meaningless world and an active construction of an alternative is very much there. And it's there in Coleridge's account of imagination, which stands as a kind of redemptive response to a world colored by original sin and therefore in need of redemptive, imaginative work if it's not going to be redeemed in some other way. Our profession, in a way, insofar as Arnold, Coleridge, the new criticism, are fundamental to have had a deep investment in starting from that premise. When I was grappling with Wordsworth and Coleridge together and trying to grapple with Coleridge, what seemed like Coleridge's misreadings of Wordsworth, it seemed to me, and still seems to me, that Wordsworth deliberately adopted an alternative premise. But it was deliberately adopted, and I think he recognized the deliberate adoption of it, and I think thereby also called attention to the deliberateness of the adoption of the other premise. That he said that finding that the grand elementary principle of pleasure that he was operating by, and the functioning with it was a task light and easy to him who looked at the world in the spirit of love. I've got kind of Rachel's dissertation behind me again on this. A task like that, but that was a deliberate looking at the world, a deliberate looking in another way. And I think the stakes at this point are stakes about choices of fundamental starting points, which of course we have been inducted into in ways that make it very difficult for us to imagine our way or think our way out of the ones that seem like they're given. But I'm admiring of your attempt, rather logically at this point, to think your way out of that negative starting point, by saying those of us who hold to it are not really consistent in our holding of it.
I will take logical as a compliment.
Yeah, I'll take it as a compliment. I admire, but that in itself is not going to fully move you to adopting an alternative premise or move the rest of us to adopting an alternative premise. But it is an admirable attempt to dig out of a widely shared premise that our profession, I would like to say, has been invested in through some of its key figures over a long period of time, and they're still haunting us.
Yeah, I mean, logical for sure. And I'm certainly trying to be, but I really am trying to do a little self-archaeology here. And I'm sure that as I dig, what I'm getting is very contradictory things. I never knew the Romantics as well as you, and haven't read them for a really long time. It seems to me that that's also true of the Romantics. That is to say, there's heroic imagination, and there's, even in Wordsworth, thinking that he will find in the world around him something that would not require so much heroic imagination. I have been obsessed forever with him schlepping his bride through country churchyards on their honeymoon, looking for poetry, on gravestones, right? That surely that's where it should be, and not poetic diction.
And in clumsy conversations with people whose consequentiality you might at first take to be zero, that turns out that there's a great reversal of your sense of who has something important to say.
Right.
I have two
Time to get some revenge.
Well, yes, it's revenge time, obviously. I have two questions for you. One is, does the imagination always have to be heroic?
So I think what I'm looking for is just a less heroic version of imagination. So maybe I would have to look elsewhere for other vocabulary, but maybe not. I think I don't know. You again probably know better than I do what the actual history of the term, how it's what trajectory it has, whether it's gotten more heroic, has come to stand for something heroic, maybe more heroic than it was earlier on, or vice versa. I don't know. I mean, imagination is not actually totally crucial to my argument in the sense that, I use Nietzschean myth or fiction. All these things seem to me part of the same constellation. But there's still this idea that all the activity comes from them, and the materials that they work on are essentially passive or even meaningless, right? You get more credit to the extent that what you're, imagining, what you're making your imagination out of is doing none of the work for you. But
Right,
maybe,
and I mean, that's my second question too, is that I made a note that this sounded to me like the closest a boundary to figure could get to Latour in a sense, because there are ways that you are engaging with some of these questions that are so big right now, right? What if we think about objects and other things as having a kind of agency that we usually reserve for the human? So I wonder, I mean, obviously I'm joking, and I apologize, but...
No, it's a good, vengeful question.
I wonder what you think about that.
You're allowed to.
Provocative.
I don't think of myself as object-oriented or object-centered, but you're totally right. The way it sounded, it certainly came out that way. So I will have to rethink my position on Latour, who of course is anything but a progressive thinker. I mean, so in that sense, we're not barking up the same tree at all. And I feel myself more impelled by the desire to get people to rethink the shapes of history than to respect objects more. But I certainly sound like I'm trying to get them to respect objects more.
Because it seems like, I mean, it would be something human, but not necessarily the heroic will that you're evaluating
Right.
or
Yeah,
describing. Yeah.
That's good revenge. Right. Thank you.
Well, thank you for...
Rachel's opened the door to her, well, actually Don opened the door to her defense earlier, so let me pick up if I can. My difference from you over the similarity between techne and places. I think Aristotle's politics gives techne to what slaves do. Has to do literally for low and necessary. Poiesis has to do with a reformation, but it's not, by definition, a reformation of that which is low and necessary. So in a way, to make some huge leaps, it's in keeping with, say, Northrop Frye, the anatomy saying that every poet works inside poetry. So for the poet, there is no real question of other poetry being there as matter or resource. Or as, and here I really regret for our reasons, that you left this here in November before I actually gave the talk. I gave it because there on Stevens, Stevens is busy trying to keep us alert to how poetry is always a transport of a transport. So that whatever poetry works upon is never capable. It's never poetry if it works upon that which is inert. Its task must be, at best, engage in some form of transport, whether that transport is efficacious or not, in moment or how, and so on.
So this goes directly to Rachel's question about a less heroic version of imagination.
Yes, except I'm going to come back around to allow two things for once. One is the question of whether imagination is heroic or not. It's the question of whether it's strong or weak. And also I'll come back to the question via the Benjamin to whether or not we are secular as human more or less. I applaud you as strongly as I can for your statement that it's time to give up the Benjaminian metaphors of the angel with the ruins of history. That's an extremely dangerous metaphor, as we not yet know, really. I said relatively scandalously here in November, listed a question from Jonathan in turn, that perhaps the problem with Benjamin, in that case in comparison to Stevens, was the Benjamin, here's the question back, Benjamin had imagination, was it strong or weak, was it heroic or defeated? I would say simply, no matter whatever terms we use to define imagination, he didn't have enough. And avenging the angel of the ruins of history is not only the fact of his not having enough, but also the knowingness of not being possible to have enough, since that undergirds the messianic model. So Jonathan interrogated by saying, sometimes you're lucky in a really bad spot. So maybe in 1940, Spain. It's okay
For sure, that was
It's
good.
okay, yeah, it's okay to be melancholy, and to take all kinds of drugs to end it all. But the question for me is what happens with the persistent embrace of that moment,
Exactly.
right? And the dire consequences of being unable to let go of that moment in our perpetual self-definition. And Benjamin himself makes the mistake that you describe so clearly of misappropriating the term progress to an early 20th century European left, Central European left position on the British Empire, and so on, which, if there was more time, would transmute into perhaps an understanding of America now, American Academy now, to a kind of left critique of American empire, which transmutes into the notion of critique of liberalism, which in turn transmutes into a critique of secularism. So the post-secularist moment, in part I think motivated by a defeat at home, attaches itself to extramural, imagined extramural practices, which has the effect of continuing the melancholy transmuted into the narrative of defeat here, which, to turn the language back, is a sign of the dearth of imagination. Now, it becomes a kind of, you know how much I dislike using this term, but it becomes in that case a kind of allegory of national disaster.
Right.
And so maybe the thing we need is not this one. What we really need here against Benjamin Lifstein is what you really need is the symbol and not allegory. Or you need the power of imagination, what we'll call the power of imagination, which seems not to be around. Hence, you know, things that all kinds of people being able to bury figures like Stevens for all kinds of relatively easily spoken political, contemporary political, ethical claims, reasons. Anyway, that's kind of the way which I'm just sort of
Yeah,
responding
that's
to
great.
all
I think
of
that's
this.
something that we're largely on the same wavelength, and you were telling me, as Rachel was saying, I can have this argument and the word imagination too. And I'm kind of willing to think that may be right. You make me think that, to the extent that I consider Aristotle in all this, my image of techne for him is derived from the rhetoric rather than from the politics. And when I go non-literary with him, I'm thinking of him talking about the captain of a ship in the storm, a general on the battlefield, a doctor dealing with a disease. These are things where you can't have certain knowledge. You know, you have to use, you have to think in a situation where you can't know enough. And, you know, I think of techne as that, rather than the mechanical reproduction of a known model as opposed to something creative. You have to be creative as a doctor, you know, as a ship captain, as a general, right? There's creativity, but it's not aesthetic versus non-aesthetic.
We can argue about that. I mean, all of those things would fall in terms of the opening chapter of the politics within the domain of what we dare call domestic management. Right? So a domestic manager would employ a ship's captain. It's not exactly analogous to a slave because there's a higher level of skill, but it's not yet poiesis. Because it's not the reformation of the ship that turns it into the trireme. That's poiesis, but it's not technique.
That sounds more like Hannah Arendt than like Aristotle to me. But
It's also it's Thucydides. Therefore, it's not Hannah Arendt, etc.
So I have a question kind of about the scope with which you're characterizing this narrative in the humanities. And so I'm thinking
I'm
about
sorry, the word?
the scope
Scope.
with which you're characterizing this sort of narrative of melancholy. Because, I mean, I think that a lot of ethnographic work, particularly, ethnographic work that's focused on community activity, it's about finding sort of vernacular theories for living. In that sense, those are sort of more humble models of imagination. And so I wonder if the vernacular might be another sort of idiom with which you can think something beyond this sort of defined narrative.
That sounds good. I sort of felt intuitively that I would have allies in other disciplines except that the allies might say, what a dull argument, we don't have that problem. And the anthropologist might well be, foremost among them.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly that, actually. I didn't quite catch
Luckily, I said it first.
well, thank you. I didn't quite catch the quote within the quote of Marshall Sahlins, but I mean, he's been doing, so maybe I didn't quite get what you meant there, but I mean, people like him have been sort of doing this kind of work for some time. I also think of Apajirai's early essays, History as a Limitless Resource, kind of critique of the notion of history as a limitless resource that we can then manipulate as well. And other people who are trying to think about sort of any history as a paradigm of exchange rather than a paradigm of production, to use Veras de Castro's terms. So I do think that, in anthropology, you would find maybe a more friendly territory.
Yeah. Well, I actually think I would find both sides of this. In fact, in that sense, it's probably closer to literary studies than not. That is, as you probably, it sounds like you know better than I do, there's a long history of this sort of salvage paradigm in which the noble anthropologist has to save peoples assumed to be disappearing. Right? And then there's a critique of that, the last decades, I forget how many decades, in which people say they're not disappearing. They're kind of doing something different, and you must think of, if you persist in using the word culture, you must think of this as adaptive and resilient and sort of moving forward. And obviously, I'm on their side, and seeing in a way that English clings to its version of the old salvage paradigm in anthropology. We must see these things as either disappearing or having disappeared so that we can get the credit for salvaging. This makes sense, anyway. Not everybody has this problem, but some of us do.
That's not exactly what I meant. I think it does make sense. But I think where I was really going with it more, in terms of the discussion of the Torah and all these other things that came up, was looking at different modes of relating to the past. And that is an anthropological project that has become pretty prominent now. So for example, yes, again, not thinking through a paradigm of production, that's what Veras de Castro says. It actually doesn't mean what it sounds like necessarily. But thinking about the past only as meaningless and then meaningless, inert matter that one then projects an image onto, but rather thinking of the past as a form of as a relationship of exchange, which he develops through.
Right.
So it's more developing just different modes of relation to the past as a sort of anthropological, historical, or ethno-historical project.
Yeah, I think that my argument with the anthropologists that you like would probably come down to me wanting to be more linear, and then they would want to be.
Right.
They would end up being.
Because what falls out of that is progress, right?
Exactly.
Exactly, yeah. So
there's lots and lots and lots of continuity between past and present in a lot of the anthropological materials. But what you give up in celebrating that continuity is the idea that things are going in a direction. But they may really be going in a direction. Global warming is only one example, but let us focus on that because it's so real. And from that, extrapolate to other things, which may be bigger than subjectivity.
You brought up global warming. This is what I wanted to ask about. Is the catastrophe piling up in the future? Right? You brought up the no future. The power of Klein's most recent book is that we need change now, or we're already past the point of no return. Right? It's not a question of history or whatnot. We've already destroyed the world. It's inevitable. The 21st century is going to be one of immense suffering and transformation. How do you talk about progress in the face of
Talk her out of that, huh?
Of that kind of vision of the progress of carbon dioxide being in the atmosphere more and more?
Well, I obviously feel, how shall I say, counterintuitive, not to say like a complete fool, raising the question of progress at this moment, when we were all sort of focused on that, probably more than we've ever been. And yet, it seemed to me perversely necessary to do, without obviously being ready to say, well, if humankind has made its mark on the world in this way, it could make its mark on the world. You know, this is no more difficult to imagine than, as Emily Klein says, you know, anti-capitalist revolution. Again, that seems really, really abstract at this moment. But I still, as an abstraction, I think it needs saying. So that's, you know, I'm not going to start saying, no, those CO2 figures are wrong. I'm not going to argue about that.
The two separate things. One, Paul mentioned your recent work, cosmopolitanism and equality, or at least equality has become an issue in some kind of way or another, more or less explicitly.
Yeah, the book has changed, it's changed a little bit, but yeah, I'm trying to think about it.
Involved in that, but more immediately I was struck by, because I like, well, I'm sure a lot, your casual remark that you didn't like.
Oh, you do like him a lot.
Yeah, that surprised me a little bit, because
You want me to go on? I can rant. I can rant on this.
yeah, I wanted you to do your critique of
well, to link it up with my talk, I would say he loads the dice in a really big way and makes, there's the melancholic who is in touch with the deeper reality, and everyone else, the conventional people, are complete fools.
right.
So that's your choice. You could either be a complete conventional fool who, teaches his classes and grades his student papers, that would be me, right? As opposed to the completely dysfunctional melancholic, dysfunctional because melancholic because whatever. And she's the only one who realized there's this asteroid that's about to destroy the world. I want to think that
it's an allegory.
Whatever. Of course, it's an allegory of a lot of things. Yeah. It's an allegory. Whatever else it is, it's an allegory. So I thought, don't divide the world up this way between, the melancholic and the idiots, because the rest of us are not all idiots, right? If you're not ready to slit your wrists, then
You didn't identify with a melancholic character.
I did not. But it's all okay. But so in Von Trier, he just tortures women. He seems to get off on torturing saintly women over and over and over again. I don't think he really asks very much what's going on in all this torture of saintly women, but I really literally don't like to watch it. And that's now, I refuse to see any more Von Trier films, some films back. In spite of my more sophisticated friends saying, you really have to, and I said, no, I'm not going to, and then finally I gave in on Melancholia.
Mania turns the tables a little bit.
Anyway, well, he likes, sort of doomed saintly females.
Or, in the case of Nymphomania, females doing things.
Well,
Kills.
okay, well,
Alright,
I stopped watching.
but you see the film as symptomatic of a larger malaise in the humanities and thought generally.
Well, no, I didn't.
James, you book that it's easier to imagine the end of the world.
I didn't need Melancholia in order to think about this. If you read Lee Edelman, you think, what the hell is going on with these guys?
Yeah.
Or, I heard a talk by a very good romanticist that looked forward with pleasure to the end of the human race. That's a form of eco-criticism that's out there. It would be like species-centric for us to think that it would be good for the human race to continue. Right? I think, okay, there's something going on here. And I don't think it's good. In the name of what? It wouldn't be human values that we would be projecting, wanting to protect trees against us or whatever. Sorry, this is at the level of rap. Yes.
May I ask a question?
You have the equality part. I don't know if you want to say a word about that.
Let me take a question. Maybe
Well, it's a question in this sort of groove of the argument, which is about the sort of, if the catastrophes are perhaps piling up in the future, I also wanted to hear a little bit more about the let's say, the catastrophes before which this thinking is taking place, because you've given us examples of different scales in terms of size and time, right? It's quite different to talk about the end of the human race to the economic crisis in Greece. And even to talk perhaps about Alexander the Great.
Well, I just picked that up because the German journalists seemed to think that this was common sense in Germany.
Sure, but I'm curious to think, well, if we're thinking in terms of economic crisis and inequality, let's say human scale versus planetary or global scale, does the conversation about this kind of overarching historical narrative of catastrophes change tenor at the very least, and what might those differences in tenor or tone be?
Yeah. So I don't think I have anything very enlightening to say about the scale question, but the essay that I've been trying to write, in which you got a piece of, was probably more about ancient catastrophe or ancient atrocity, and accepting the linearity of time as a way of letting go of a sense of aggrieved identity based on past catastrophe. And that's where I find myself actually liking something about Kundera, who sometimes really drives me nuts, but seems to have that, let us accept that time really is linear, and he of course is totally anti-progress, but for him I think what it means is being forced to let go of ethical judgments of what happened in the past. And I have genuinely mixed feelings about that. To some extent, I'm on his side. And I brought up, I think it was rhetorically a little bit too complicated because I'm on the Greek side, but I think that the comment about Alexander the Great had a point. And that has to do with why it is ethically advantageous to reconsider the linearity of time positively, right? That is not, I don't know, there's a museum in the Turkish part of Nicosia on Cyprus where there have been mandatory visits for all Turkish children to this, school children, to a museum which shows huge bloody photographs of the victims of atrocities committed against Turkish Cypriots by Greek Cypriots. And the idea was every Turkish child must be taken to this museum. And that really kind of stuck with me. So there's a model for salvage of the past. We don't want to let it recede, and we want to make sure that it stays as up to the minute as possible by feeding it to all of our children and keeping alive the sense this just happened. So again, I don't know exactly what the mechanism, the distancing mechanism that we need in a case like this would be, but I feel like, okay, it's not that, right? So if that's a model for humanity, it's not a good model for the humanities. Mandatory visits to the Atrocity Museum.
That was.
I was just going to say we have time for one more question.
That was the only question I wrote down when you spoke. What would be the metrics, right?
Well, I don't know.
What do you do when you go back to the question of the tenor of trauma and your valid point about it? The event's not really being natural in case you get out there. When the trauma continues.
Well, for me, that is the
So,
one
for instance, the
pressure.
Spiegel just yesterday salvaged a piece they wrote in 1990 about the reparation that they wrote in 1990, marking the way in which the successive German governments deferred addressing it when they had the means because of the issues of reunification, right, which is making a record of an ongoing trauma. So that the moment of recollection here is not one of salvaging something that is in a distant past, but rather the populations who are still experiencing the effects of certain forces of history.
Yeah.
I mean, the book on the architectural concepts is quite interesting as an example of this. It's noteworthy, this long account of the Anglophone history of human rights. Not one reference, not one, to Africa or African Americans, no Frederick Douglass, no Du Bois. I'm talking about the context, the temporal context of the argument about rights. The only no reference to slavery. Is the metaphor of slavery for the colonists? No reference to slaves, right? And in the whole conversation about the problem of the discipline erases the very move of history we want to talk about, and poses the question of trauma in fundamentally Benjaminian terms, as if this is something that's out there, and how do we connect to it? It seems the question comes even on the question of imagination. Why must we begin with Brown, Gardner, or Kant, and then focusing on Wordsworth and Coleridge in understanding the question of imagination, and dropping out all kinds of complicated long histories of imagination that come to converge in the spatial way that Terry was talking about in our moment. That was an important question. How can we think history in ways that address confluence and still are linear?
Well, I mean, you know, down and dirty, I'm, I suppose, a presentist. And the ongoing nature of the suffering is the criterion that I will almost immediately, instinctively go to. That there are some where it's clear that the grievance is ongoing, the consequences of it are visible, and there are others, in other cases, in which that is less true. Now, what seems to me characteristic of the humanities, you could argue with me here, is that no one wants to say that there are any cases in which it's less true.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you'll say slavery and look at the ongoing consequences, and I will say the Palestinians, and it's not just the Lydda massacre in July 1948, it's now. Ethnic cleansing is happening now, right? But each time you say that and I say that, whoever it is who is identified with whatever the grievance is, whatever the atrocity is, will say, sorry, you're going to leave us out of this? And what you get is the universalization.
It's not true that it turns out we find humanities. I could give names. Fred Moore, Naomi Chandler, Will Alexander, who are saying it is less true. In other words, those positive statements are being performed in this effort to articulate a notion of the present that sees the good coming out of the relationship to the past. And that's the scholarship, that's the work, to use your term, that drops out of our discussion when we consider the problem. Right? Okay. So that the description of the problem is too focused on a specific corner of the work of the discipline. Right. That was the thrust of, and that's what I thought was the thrust of the question about the different terms of trauma as well. We have to stop just talking to ourselves about ourselves.
All right. Next paper I give will not be talking to ourselves about ourselves. I'll talk about something somewhere further away.
No.
Bruce, thank you very much.
Thank you all.